This is a presentation about behavioral leadership theory. In this presentation, I will give you a description of behavioral leadership. I will give you some ideas of some underlying beliefs and assumptions about this type of leadership. I will tell you the main developers of this leadership theory, and I will give you some pros and cons of the theory as they relate to education and industry. This presentation was created by Danielle Collins, myself, for Education 5401. Behavioral leadership theory grew out of the limitations of trait theory that described only the mental, physical, or social characteristics of leaders. Rather than asking who leaders are, researchers began to study the behaviors of great leaders and ask questions like, what do effective leaders do? And what leadership behaviors lead to increased productivity and employee satisfaction? Behavioral theory suggests that there are a generic set of leadership skills and a common body of knowledge that any potential leader can access. This theory of leadership is linked to behaviorist psychology and is related to the stimulus response and if-then theories of behavioral psychology. For example, if leaders behave this way, then employees will respond that way. Behavioral leadership theorists are moving away from the assumption that leaders are born and toward the idea that leaders can be made through studying effective behaviors and then practicing those effective behaviors. These behaviorists started to consider employee relationships in leadership and realized that employee motivation and satisfaction should be factored into the equation for productivity. They also considered Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Frederick McGregor's X and Y theories. For example, X leaders are more autocratic and correspond to the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for safety and physiological needs. This is more transactional, whereas Y leaders on McGregor's grid correspond to esteem and belonging and are therefore more transformational in nature. The main contributors and developers of behavioral leadership theory can be seen on this timeline. Starting in 1939 in Iowa State, Kurt Lewin and Associates found that there were three different styles of leadership, in particular around decision-making. They were autocratic, democratic, and laissez-faire. In 1950s, the Michigan Leadership Studies, ran by Rensis Leichhardt, found that there were two styles of leadership based on job-centered and employee-centered leadership, but also added that there was participative leadership for leading teams, and they added that after the Ohio findings. In 1960, Theory X and Y by McGregor posited that a leader should behave in a specific way on a continuum, autocratically or democratically, based on perceived attitudes of subordinates towards work. In 1964, Leadership Behavior Description Questionnaire, the LBDQ, was created in Ohio State Leadership Studies. Dr. Carol Shartle, Hempel, and Coons developed a 10-year interdisciplinary study in which they took the attitudes and opinions of subordinates to talk about their leadership in business, education, and government sectors. They used Likert scale type questions in their studies as well. In 1964, the managerial grid was created by Blake and Moulton. They plotted leadership styles based on production and people-oriented objectives of leaders. This was also based on a continuum. In 1973, there was a continuum of leadership created by Tannenbaum and Schmidt, which was moving towards contingency and situational leadership theory. They believed that leaders behave a certain way until trust and respect is established, and then they lead more loosely. As mentioned, the managerial grid by Blake and Moulton was an important and significant contributor to behavioral leadership theories. They used Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Douglas McGregor's X and Y theories to develop a grid based on two behavioral objectives. On the x-axis was task-oriented leadership behavior, which was concerned with high productivity, efficiency, organization, concrete objectives, and how best to accomplish a task. For the y-axis, people-oriented leadership behaviors included considering employees as individuals with personal needs and developmental goals. They were concerned about relationships. Blake and Moulton recognized there were 5 leadership styles. A leader that was concerned mainly about people but not as much on productivity were considered to have a country club style leadership. For leaders that were more concerned about productivity but not concerned about people, this would be a produce or perish type leadership. This would be more in line with a leader who worked in a factory, for example. For leaders that were high productivity and highly concerned with people, those would be team leaders. Blake and Moulton also found that there were 7 key elements of effective leadership behavior. For instance, initiative behaviors was like taking action, driving, and supporting subordinates. Inquiry behaviors included questioning, researching, and verifying understanding of employees. Advocacy included expressing convictions and championing ideas. Decision-making was evaluating resources, choices, and consequences, and conflict resolution was confronting and resolving disagreements. Resilience was dealing with problems, setbacks, and failures, and critique was delivering objective, candid feedback. They found that from the grid, leaders who were middle-of-the-road leaders who were equally concerned about people and productivity had most of these 7 effective leadership behaviors. The continuum of leadership behavior by Tannenbaum and Schmidt is more of a contingency theory of leadership that posits that the behavior of the leader should change on a continuum between autocratic style and democratic style, with consideration for situational circumstances and objectives. Like Blake and Moulton, Tannenbaum and Schmidt moved around 2 key leadership objectives: consideration, which is similar to the y-axis on Blake and Moulton's grid, and initiating structure, which would be similar to the x-axis of the managerial grid by Blake and Moulton. For example, for Tannenbaum and Schmidt, on the autocratic side of the continuum, a leader that tells, makes the decision, and expects the team to follow. This can be useful if you have a lot of new employees to manage, but continued use of this style can soon become frustrating, especially if team members are highly experienced. On the more democratic side of the continuum, the leader may abdicate for the team, asking the team to define the problem for itself and deciding how to solve it themselves. The team makes the final decision, but the leader is still responsible for its outcome, be it a successful or failure outcome. The 7 leadership styles broadly correspond to a team's level of development. As trust and competency grow, so does the amount of freedom that the team members want and that leaders feel comfortable providing. Behavioral leadership theory can be applied to and has parallels with education in many ways. For instance, the scientific management theory of Taylorism is where behavioral leadership almost started out. They focused on industrial productivity, including how best to lead students and teach students to perform at optimal levels. These ignored individual students' needs and assumed consistent causality. Another example is the increase of investment into teacher training, just like they had more investment into leadership training, instead of believing that leaders could be just born, they realized that you could train teachers and leaders to be better teachers and leaders. However, there's also a focus on teacher standardization and regulation to achieve a higher performance of students on achievement tests. Eventually, there is a study into a more democratic consideration of student behavior, student needs, and student development by Dewey, rather than a focus only on curriculum and autocratic styles of teaching to meet productivity objectives or higher scores on standardized tests. They also moved away from only reading, writing, and arithmetic to more citizenship and fulfillment of students' needs. An increase in democracy and civil rights in general during the 1950s to the 1970s history contributed to studies that considered attitudes and liberties of workers, or in this case, teachers and students. Eventually, there is less focus on teacher as autocratic figure that imparts information to students and more on ideal behavior of teachers to increase measurable performance goals and student motivation and happiness. There is also a focus on product end rather than process of learning in itself in relationships with self, others, environment, industry, community, etc. One is more transactional, and now we're moving towards more transformational teaching. The pros and cons of behavioral leadership theory are as follows. Behavioral leadership theory challenges the notion of trait leadership and great man theories, which suppose that leaders are born leaders and not made. This idea that leaders could develop into better leaders was transformational for leadership. Also, behavioral leadership theory increased investment and training for developing better teachers or leaders. They also considered the subordinates or students as individuals with needs, strengths, and goals of their own. Some cons of behavioral leadership theory include the fact that most of the research on behavioral leadership was based on questions, which is then affected by participant and researcher bias, ambiguous interpretation, halo effect of leaders, false memory, etc. So they couldn't always be relied upon, and causality is not necessarily confirmed. Another con is that this kind of leadership may create a homogenized version or vision of what makes a good leader. It oversimplifies contributing factors that may affect success or failure of students or subordinates. It only represents a Western culture and perhaps a gender bias. Researchers often themselves selected their own list of what they perceived as top leadership behaviors and qualities to include in the questionnaires. They also, like mentioned before, causality and behavior and effect is difficult to prove or may not be able to repeat. It does little to understand situational or individual circumstances or personalities, motivations of subordinates and students. One last con is that most studies focus on transactional leadership workplaces, whereas now we're moving towards transformational leadership practices and behaviors.